The hiss of the coffee maker was the loudest sound in my apartment. It was a Tuesday, or maybe a Wednesday. The days had started to bleed together after the grant money dried up, leaving me with little more than my own thoughts and a mountain of unread research papers. I used to love those papers, used to pore over them, tracing the faint whispers of distant galaxies, imagining the grand, silent ballet of creation. Now, they just felt like a collection of increasingly elaborate lies. I poured the lukewarm liquid into a chipped mug, the ceramic gritty beneath my fingers. Another day, another futile attempt to find meaning in the void. My gaze drifted to the window, where the sky was a bruised, indifferent gray. It was always gray here, at this god-forsaken outpost. The kind of gray that leached the color out of everything, including my own spirit. I was Dean, an astrophysicist who had once dreamt of charting new nebulae, of discovering the secrets held within collapsing stars. Now, my days were spent monitoring atmospheric data at the weather station, Aurora behaving wrong. It was a quaint name for a place that felt anything but. The constant hum of the machinery, the biting Arctic wind that rattled the corrugated metal walls, the perpetual twilight that settled in for months on end, it all conspired to create an atmosphere of profound, soul-crushing isolation. My colleagues, a handful of weary souls just like me, mostly kept to themselves. We shared the same cramped living quarters, the same bland rations, the same quiet desperation. There was the technician, a burly man with calloused hands and a perpetual frown, who could coax life out of any piece of malfunctioning equipment. There was the meteorologist, a woman with eyes that had seen too many storms, who spoke in hushed tones about barometric pressure and wind shear. And then there was me, the resident stargazer, tasked with observing the aurora, a phenomenon that had long since lost its magic for me. Tonight, however, something was different. The aurora, usually a vibrant dance of emerald and violet, was still. It hung in the sky like a painted backdrop, unnervingly silent. Technician had grumbled about a solar flare, the meteorologist about unusual atmospheric conditions. But I knew, with a certainty that prickled the back of my neck, that this was no natural occurrence. I was in the main observation room, a sterile space dominated by banks of monitors displaying incomprehensible streams of data. The air was thick, with the scent of ozone and stale coffee. I ran a hand over my unshaven jaw, feeling the stubble scrape against my skin. My fingers traced the cool, smooth surface of the console. It was the same routine, day in and day out. Check the readings, log the anomalies, try to convince myself that this was still important work. Then I saw it, a flicker on one of the deep space scanners, a signal, not the usual random cosmic noise, but something structured, something intentional. My heart, a muscle I had long suspected of developing its own independent and rather pessimistic consciousness, gave a sudden, sharp lurch. I leaned closer, my breath fogging the screen. The signal was weak, almost imperceptible, but it was there. It originated from a sector of space that was supposed to be utterly empty. No stars, no nebulae, no known celestial bodies, just black. My hands, usually steady, trembled as I tapped at the keyboard, isolating the frequency. The signal pulsed, a slow, deliberate rhythm that seemed to bypass my ears and vibrate directly in my bones. It was like nothing I had ever encountered in my years of study. No known natural phenomenon could produce such a clean, repeating pattern. The technician shuffled in, his boots thudding softly on the linoleum floor. He grunted, a sound that was his usual greeting. "Still at it, Dean?" I didn't look up. "There's something here," I murmured, my voice hoarse. He peered over my shoulder, his brow furrowed. "What is it?" "A signal," I said, my eyes glued to the screen. "From Sector 7G, it's structured," he scoffed. "Probably just interference from the aurora. It's been acting up something fierce." "This isn't aurora interference," I insisted, my voice rising with a frustration I hadn't felt in years. "This is different, it's deliberate." He shrugged, his interest clearly waning. "Whatever I say, Dean, don't let it keep eye up." He ambled out, leaving me alone once more with the hum of the machines and the insistent pulse of the signal. I continued to analyze it, my disillusionment momentarily forgotten, replaced by a flicker of the old fire. This was it. This was what I had been searching for, what I had always believed was out there, waiting to be found. What was sending this signal, and why from a place that was supposed to be nothing? The flickering monitor, was the only light in my cramped observation room, save for the sickly green glow of the status LEDs on the server racks. The rest of the crew had long since retreated to their bunks, the distant clatter of mess trays and muffled laughter a fading echo. They dismissed the signal as a glitch, a phantom in the ether, another anomaly in the vast, indifferent void, but I knew. I could feel it humming beneath my skin, a discordant note in the symphony of the cosmos. My fingers danced across the keyboard, a blur of motion fueled by lukewarm coffee and an escalating sense of unease. The signal wasn't just unusual, it was wrong. The patterns were too precise, too deliberate, yet utterly alien. It wasn't the rhythmic pulse of a pulsar, nor the chaotic hiss of cosmic background radiation. This was structured, like a whisper meant for ears that weren't quite calibrated for its frequency. Every attempt to categorize it, to fit it into a known astrophysical phenomenon, failed. It was like trying to pour water into a sieve. The data simply refused to conform. My disillusionment, the gnawing apathy that had settled over me like a shroud after years of staring at predictable starlight, was evaporating. In its place was a prickle of something far more potent. The air in the room grew heavy, thick with the stale scent of recycled oxygen and the metallic tang of overloaded circuits. Outside, the perpetual twilight of the Arctic sky was supposed to be a canvas of dancing auroras. But tonight, they were behaving wrong. Instead of the usual ethereal ribbons of green and violet, the sky was a bruised, pulsating crimson. It bled across the horizon, an unsettling stain that mirrored the frantic rhythm of the signal on my screen. A shadow fell across my workspace. I flinched, my hand hovering over the emergency shutdown. Still at it, Dean. It was the chief engineer. He stood silhouetted against the dim light of the corridor, his arms crossed, a slight frown creasing his brow. Just running some diagnostics, I hedged, my voice a little rough. I'd been lost in the data for hours. He stepped further into the room, the metallic clang of his boots on the grating echoing unnervingly. He peered at my monitor, his gaze sweeping over the complex waveforms. Looks like a mess. System overload. No, it's the signal. It's not behaving as expected. He let out a short, humorless laugh. Expected by whom, Dean? The universe doesn't exactly fill out paperwork before it does something weird. He gestured vaguely at the screen. It's probably just some atmospheric interference, a solar flare hitting us at a funny angle. Happens all the time up here. This isn't atmospheric, I insisted, my voice gaining an edge I didn't intend. And it's not solar. The origin point is impossible. His frown deepened. He walked closer, his breath misting in the cool air. The smell of oil and sweat clung to him. Impossible how? Did I triangulate it to the back of the fridge? I ignored his sarcasm, my gaze fixed on the coordinates flashing on a secondary display. It's coming from Sector 7G. There's nothing there. No stars, no nebulae, not even dust clouds. It's empty. He leaned in, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the readouts. Sector 7G, it's a black hole out there, Dean. Nothing comes out of a black hole, especially not a signal. Exactly, I said, the word tasting like ash. And yet here it is, persistent, structured, and the closer I get to isolating its source, the more complex it becomes. He pulled back, rubbing his chin. The crimson aurora outside seemed to pulse in time with my own erratic heartbeat. Look, Dean, I appreciate my dedication. Really. But we've got 100 critical systems to maintain. We can't afford to chase ghosts, especially not when the sky looks like it's about to fall on our heads. He gestured towards the reinforced viewport. That aurora, it's not normal. The instruments are going haywire. We need to focus on keeping this place running, not on some phantom signal from the middle of nowhere. He was right, of course. The aurora was a more tangible threat. It was a physical manifestation of something wrong. But the signal felt like the source. I'll just run a few more tests, I said, my eyes already drifting back to the monitor. The chief engineer sighed, a weary sound, and turned to leave. Don't say I didn't warn you when I rest staring at that screen until sunrise and still haven't found anything, he said, his voice trailing off as he disappeared back into the sterile corridor. I was alone again. The hum of the machines seemed to thrum with a new intensity, a low, guttural vibration that resonated in my bones. The crimson light outside bled through the viewport, painting the interior of the station in hellish hues. The signal pulsed, a heartbeat from the emptiness, and it was getting stronger. I ran another diagnostic, pushing the system beyond its recommended limits. The data that flooded my screen was unlike anything I had ever seen. It wasn't just a signal. It was a tapestry of impossible geometries, a language written in dimensions I couldn't perceive. And at its core, buried beneath layers of alien complexity, was a pattern, a name. Where had I heard it before? The air in the control room of the weather station, Aurora behaving wrong, was thick with the smell of ozone and stale coffee. Outside, the sky was a riot of unnatural color. Not the gentle greens and purples of a normal aurora, but jagged streaks of violent violet and an electric pulsing orange that seemed to hum with a low, resonant frequency. It was beautiful in a way that made my teeth ache. I ran a hand over my stubbled chin, the rough texture a small anchor in the swirling chaos outside. The signal, that was the real problem. The aurora was a symptom, a visual manifestation of a cosmic fever. But the signal, faint as it was, felt like the disease itself. I'd been staring at the spectral analysis for hours, my eyes burning, the lines blurring and reforming into impossible shapes. The hum from the aurora seemed to seep through the reinforced walls of the station, a deep thrum that vibrated in my chest cavity. It wasn't a sound I could pinpoint on any scale, not a frequency I recognized. It felt like a pressure behind the eyes. My fingers, clumsy and stiff, danced across the keyboard. I was trying to isolate the carrier wave, to strip away the static, the natural radio interference that usually peppered these readings. But this wasn't static. This was structured, deliberate, and impossibly old. The decay rates I was seeing, they suggested a source that predated human civilization by millennia. Eons, perhaps. The raw data was a mess of overlapping waveforms, a cacophony of digital noise. But I was looking for patterns, for the subtle echoes that would betray the underlying message. It was like listening for a single voice in a hurricane. Then I saw it, a repeating sequence buried deep within the noise, a prime number sequence, simple, elegant, and utterly alien. No terrestrial radio transmission would use such a fundamental mathematical constant as a marker. It was a universal handshake, a cosmic greeting card. My heart gave a strange, hard lurch. Not the frantic pounding I might have expected, but a heavy, slow beat against my ribs. This wasn't just a signal, it was a deliberate communication. I rerouted the signal through a decryption algorithm I'd been developing for years, a theoretical tool designed to sift through extraterrestrial radio chatter. It was a long shot, a desperate attempt to make sense of something that was already defying all logic. The program churned, its progress bar inching along like a glacier. Outside, the aurora flared, a blinding white light momentarily washing out the bizarre colors. The hum intensified, a low groan that seemed to emanate from the very bedrock beneath the station. The air grew colder, not the biting chill of the Arctic night, but a deep, bone-penetrating cold that had nothing to do with temperature. It felt wrong. I shivered, pulling my worn jacket tighter. The decryption program pinged. A single, stark notification flashed on the screen. Decryption complete, source data anomalous. Anomalous, that was an understatement. The decoded sequence wasn't language, not as I understood it. It was geometry, abstract, shifting, impossible geometric forms that seemed to fold in on themselves. It was a blueprint, a diagram of something that defied three-dimensional space. It was a representation of a consciousness that existed outside of my frame of reference. I zoomed in on one of the rendered forms. It pulsed, a slow, rhythmic expansion and contraction, mirroring the unnatural light show outside. And then within the shifting geometry, I saw it. A shape, subtle at first, it resolved itself slowly, terrifyingly. It was an eye, not an eye like mine or any animal I knew. This eye was vast, impossibly so, its iris a swirling nebula of colors that mirrored the aurora. It was a single, lidless orb, staring out from the decoded signal, from the heart of the impossible geometry. And it was looking directly at me. This wasn't just a discovery, it was an encounter. The signal wasn't just a transmission, it was a gaze. The hum outside reached a crescendo, a deafening roar that vibrated through the metal floor. Only the eerie, pulsing glow of the aurora, now a blinding white, illuminated the room. And on the screen, the eye remained, vast and ancient, its gaze fixed upon me. What was it looking at, beyond my own terrified reflection? The signal wasn't just abstract geometry anymore. It was in the data streams, bleeding through the usual static like a stain. I'd isolated the source to a remote region, a void where there should be nothing, but the signature persisted, and it was growing. The sheer wrongness of it gnawed at me. My colleagues, the ones who hadn't already written me off as a crackpot chasing ghosts in the radio waves, were starting to get twitchy. Whispers followed me down the sterile corridors of the observatory. I could feel their eyes, not with curiosity, but with a kind of wary, almost fearful pity. I needed to see it, not just the data, but the source, or as close to it as I could get. My research grant, long since depleted, was a joke, but I had savings, enough for a few what they called field trips, and I knew just the place. The old weather station, Aurora, behaving wrong. It was remote, isolated, and according to its last operational logs, it had been picking up anomalies, strange atmospheric readings, disruptions in satellite communication, all attributed to unusual auroral activity. Unusual was an understatement, I suspected. The drive there was long, the landscape stretching out in an endless, monotonous gray. The air grew thin, biting at my exposed skin when I stopped the car to stretch my legs. The silence was profound, broken only by the crunch of gravel under my boots and the distant, mournful cry of a hawk. It felt like the edge of the world, a place where the usual rules of existence began to fray. The weather station, Aurora behaving wrong, stood against the bruised twilight sky like a skeletal monument. It was smaller than I'd imagined, a squat, utilitarian structure of rusted metal and peeling paint. A single, dead antenna pointed accusingly at the heavens. The wind here didn't just blow, it sighed, a low, mournful sound that seemed to carry the weight of ages. I felt a prickle of unease, a subtle shift in the air that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature. It was a feeling of being watched, not by eyes, but by something far more pervasive, something that permeated the very atmosphere. Inside, dust motes danced in the weak light filtering through grimy windows. The air was stale, carrying the faint, metallic tang of decay and something else. Something I couldn't quite place, a scent like ozone and old blood. The equipment was archaic, a relic of a bygone era, yet it was functional. I powered up the main console, the hum of the old machinery a surprisingly comforting sound. Then I saw it. On one of the monitors, an old analog display, the aural readings were wrong, utterly, profoundly wrong. The usual rippling curtains of light were replaced by sharp, jagged lines, pulsing with an unnatural intensity. They weren't behaving like any aurora I'd ever seen. They were structured, like the geometry from the signal. It was the same impossible pattern, rendered in light and energy across the sky. My breath hitched. This wasn't a natural phenomenon. I leaned closer, my fingers tracing the cool, dusty surface of the console. A low thrumming began not from the machinery, but from somewhere outside. It vibrated through the floor, up my legs, into my teeth. Only the eerie, pulsing glow from the aurora display provided any illumination, casting my face in shifting shades of green and violet. The thrumming intensified, a deep, resonant vibration that felt as though it were coming from the very core of the earth. Outside, the wind howled, no longer a mournful sigh, but a furious shriek. I stumbled towards the door, my heart racing. I had to get out of here. This was too much. The signal, the aurora, this feeling. It was all connected, and it was all deeply, terrifyingly wrong. But as my hand reached for the cold metal of the door handle, I stopped. On the wall, scrawled in what looked like dried mud, was a symbol, a perfect, impossible geometry mirroring the patterns on the screen, mirroring the signal. It wasn't just a symbol, it was a signature, and it felt familiar, as if it had been waiting for me. The thrumming outside grew louder, closer. The ground beneath my feet trembled. I could feel it now. A pressure building, an invisible force pressing in on me. The air grew thick, heavy, difficult to breathe. What was this place? What had I found? And what was coming for me? The data streams were a mess. Not just the usual cosmic background hiss, but something else, something that felt wet, like ink spreading on parchment. I'd been staring at the monitors for what felt like days, my eyes burning, the stale air of my office thick with the smell of old coffee and desperation. The signal, it was no longer a faint whisper from the void. It was a roar, a jagged tear in the silence. It pulsed, and with each pulse, the static on my screen seemed to writhe, coalescing into shapes that defied geometry, that clawed at the edges of my vision. I had to get out. The office, my familiar sanctuary of equations and charts, suddenly felt like a cage. The city, with its predictable hum of traffic and distant sirens, seemed too small, too fragile. The anomaly was out there, in the vast indifference of space, but its echo was here, in the marrow of my bones. I needed to see it, to feel it, to understand what this impossible noise was doing to my world. My old Jeep, a sputtering relic I'd kept running out of sheer stubbornness, coughed to life. The road north was a ribbon of cracked asphalt, unwinding into a landscape that grew increasingly desolate. The usual signs of civilization, scattered farmhouses, rusting billboards had long since vanished. Now, only skeletal trees clawed at the bruised twilight sky. The destination was the weather station, Aurora behaving wrong. A government relic, abandoned years ago, perched on a lonely ridge overlooking a frozen lake. I dismissed it as folklore, as the ramblings of isolated communities. Now it felt like a beacon. As I crested the final rise, the station came into view. But it wasn't the station that seized my attention. It was the sky, the aurora. It was a spectacle, yes, but not the kind I'd studied. Instead of the ethereal greens and purples of the magnetosphere interacting with solar wind, this was a maelstrom of color. Deep, bruised violets bled into sickly yellows, streaks of violent crimson slashed across the horizon. It pulsed, not with the gentle rhythm of natural displays, but with a frantic, irregular beat, mirroring the signal that had consumed my life. The air thrummed with a low, almost imperceptible vibration, a resonance that seemed to emanate from the very ground beneath my feet. I killed the engine. I stepped out of the Jeep, the snow crunching under my boots. It seeped into my clothes, into my skin, and for a moment I felt a strange kinship with the frozen landscape. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath. I could feel it now, a tangible presence in the air, a pressure behind my eyes. It wasn't just a radio wave. It was something that resonated with the fundamental structure of existence, something that was unmaking it. The aurora, with its impossible colors and chaotic dance, felt like a symptom, a visual manifestation of the disruption. I walked towards the weather station, drawn by an invisible thread. The concrete was slick with ice. My mind reeled. This wasn't just about a strange signal anymore. This was about something else. Something ancient and vast and utterly alien. I reached the station's rusted metal door. It was heavy, stubborn. I pushed. It groaned open, revealing a pitch-black interior. The smell that wafted out was damp, metallic, and something else. Something acrid like ozone after a lightning strike, but deeper, more primal. Dust motes danced in the light. Abandoned equipment lay scattered, covered in a thick blanket of white. Old charts, their ink faded, clung to the walls. A broken radio console sat on a workbench, its dials frozen. This place was a tomb, a forgotten outpost, but the hum was louder in here, vibrating through the floor, through my very bones. It felt like being inside a colossal sleeping machine. I moved deeper into the structure, my flashlight beam sweeping across the decaying machinery. In the center of the main room, a massive, cylindrical object stood, draped in a tattered tarp. It was too large to have been brought in through the door. This wasn't on any of the schematics I'd managed to find. Hesitantly, I reached out and pulled at the tarp. It tore with a sound like ripping flesh. Beneath it, revealed in the harsh glare of my flashlight, was not metal, not concrete, but something that looked like obsidian, yet pulsed with a faint, internal luminescence. It was covered in intricate, swirling patterns that shifted and reformed as I watched. Patterns that mirrored the impossible geometries I'd seen in the signal data. The hum intensified, pressing in on me, a physical force. My breath hitched. This was the source, or a part of it. This impossible object, humming with a power that seemed to bleed from another dimension, housed in a derelict weather station under a sky that bled color. What was it? And why was it here now? It was waiting. The air in the remote outpost was thin and bitingly cold, a stark contrast to the humid warmth of my old office. I'd driven for what felt like an eternity, the gravel crunching under the tires of my beat-up sedan, the signal growing stronger with every mile. Now I stood in the heart of the weather station, Aurora behaving wrong, a name that had become disturbingly literal. The aurora, usually a silent ballet of green and violet, writhed overhead with a sickly, pulsing crimson. It wasn't just the color, it was the sound. A low, guttural hum vibrated through the metal structure of the station. A sound that seemed to resonate not in my ears, but in my bones. My fingers, stiff with cold, fumbled with the lock on the main console. The data feeds here were raw, unfiltered. This was where the anomaly was strongest, where the sky itself seemed to bleed. The hum intensified as I powered up the ancient equipment, the screens flickering to life with a cascade of nonsensical readings. But amidst the chaos, I saw it. The pattern. It wasn't just a signal anymore. It was a presence. It was singing. I'd brought a portable amplifier, a relic from my college days, thinking I might need to boost the signal. Now I connected it to the primary receiver, my heart thudding a heavy, insistent rhythm against my ribs. The hum from the aurora outside seemed to synchronize with the frantic pulse in my chest. I braced myself, flipping the switch. The sound that erupted was beyond anything I could have imagined. It clawed at my mind, attempting to pry open the tightly sealed chambers of my sanity. I saw flashes, not of images, but of concepts, vast, impossible geometries, colors that had no name, a profound, crushing loneliness that stretched back further than time itself. My hands flew across the console, desperate to isolate the source, to understand the language of this cosmic lament. The crimson aurora pulsed faster, each beat sending a ripple of unease through the station. The metal groaned, the very foundations of the building protesting the strain. I felt a pressure building behind my eyes, a physical manifestation of the overwhelming influx of information, of wrongness. I saw the creature then, not with my eyes, but within the data. It was ancient, immeasurably so, and it was awake. It had been a whisper in the cosmic background radiation for eons, a faint anomaly that only the most sensitive instruments could detect. Now, its song was growing louder, its influence spreading like a stain across the universe. The readings spiked. The hum became a shriek. I could feel it, a tendril of its consciousness reaching out, brushing against the edges of my awareness. It was curious. It was hungry. My breath hitched. My lungs burned. The amplifier on the console began to emit a high-pitched whine, a sound that was beginning to warp the very air around it. The screens flickered violently, displaying fragmented visions of worlds unmade, of stars consumed. This wasn't an investigation anymore. This was a confrontation. The entity's song was a siren's call, promising oblivion, a release from the petty struggles of existence, the end of light of life of possibility. I had to stop it, but how? The signal was no longer just a broadcast. It was a direct connection, a bridge being forged between its realm and mine. And the weather station, with its sensitive equipment, was acting as a conduit, amplifying its presence. My gaze fell upon the emergency shutdown protocol, but this was no ordinary connection. This was a cosmic entity. Would a simple shutdown even work, or would it merely sever the link, leaving it to find another way, perhaps a more direct one? The crimson light outside pulsed one last, agonizing time. A crack, thin as a spiderweb, snaked across the reinforced window. The entity's song reached a crescendo, a sound that threatened to shatter the very air. My fingers hovered over the emergency shutdown, but a new thought, born of the entity's own alien logic, began to form in my mind. If it was a song, perhaps it could be answered. Perhaps it could be drowned out. I looked at the amplifier, then at the console. The data streams were still a chaotic mess, but now a new possibility, terrifying and exhilarating, began to take shape. Could I use its own power against it? Could I amplify something else? The crack in the window widened, a shard of ice-like glass skittering across the floor. The hum of the aurora outside was no longer just a sound. It was a physical force, pressing in on me, on the station, on everything. The entity was at the threshold, and I had to decide. Was there a counter-frequency, or was I simply delaying the inevitable, playing my last card in a game I was destined to lose? What had I unleashed? The wind howled, a mournful, keening sound that vibrated through the thin metal walls of the weather station. It wasn't just the wind, though. It was something else, a deeper thrumming that seemed to originate from the very ground beneath my feet. The aurora, usually a breathtaking dance of greens and purples, was a sickly, pulsing crimson, writhing like a wounded beast against the Inkai sky. I'd seen it before, the aurora, but never like this, never with this malevolent energy. My hands still trembled, a lingering phantom sensation of that clinging to my fingertips. My device lay inert on the workbench, its usual hum silenced. It had done what I'd asked and then some. It had sung its song and the void had answered. But the answer, it wasn't a message I could translate. It was a feeling, a vast, ancient hunger. I ran a hand over my stubbled chin, the rough texture a small, grounding sensation in the disorienting stillness that had fallen after the initial surge. The air tasted of ozone and something metallic, like old blood, or maybe that was just my imagination. Now it felt like it had been given permission to run wild, unchecked. I walked over to the reinforced window, peering out at the desolate landscape. Snow drifted in lazy spirals, obscuring the jagged peaks of the mountains that ringed this god-forsaken place. It was beautiful in a terrifying, grotesque way, like a masterpiece painted with decay. The wind seemed to have momentarily held its breath, and the thrumming beneath the earth had ceased. It was a pregnant pause, a moment of anticipation. I felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, the instinctual warning of a predator, but there was no predator to see, only the vast, empty expanse and the unsettling glow of the sky. I thought back to the moment the signal had crested, the brief, blinding flash of insight that had flooded my mind. It wasn't data. It wasn't equations. It was a glimpse, a sliver of comprehension that had shattered my understanding of everything. The universe wasn't just empty space and distant stars. It was teeming, and what teemed was ancient, vast, and utterly indifferent to our fragile existence. My breath hitched in my throat, a faint, almost imperceptible shift in the light outside. I blinked, my eyes straining in the dim, crimson glow. Nothing, just the swirling snow and the contorted trees. I turned back to the workbench, my gaze falling on the deactivated device. It had been my folly, my hubris. I had reached out and something had reached back, and now it was here, or at least its influence was. The wrongness of the aurora, the unsettling stillness, the phantom sensations, they were all echoes. Ripples from a stone dropped into a pond that was far, far larger than I had ever conceived. I picked up the device, its metal cool and smooth against my skin. It felt heavy, not in weight, but in implication. It was a key, and I had turned it in a lock I didn't understand. What had I invited into this quiet corner of the world? A sudden, sharp crack echoed from somewhere beyond the station. My head snapped up, my body tensing. It sounded like ice breaking, but too loud, too deliberate. I moved towards the door, my hand reaching for the heavy bolt. The crimson light outside seemed to intensify, pulsing with a renewed, frantic rhythm. I could feel it now, a palpable pressure in the air, a wrongness that seeped into my very bones. The device in my hand felt suddenly inadequate, a child's toy against an unimaginable force. I braced myself, my eyes fixed on the door. The creaking started then, slow and agonizingly deliberate, like something immense and unseen was testing its weight against the metal. What was out there, waiting in the unnatural crimson twilight? And how could I possibly defend myself against a hunger that spanned galaxies? The aurora, usually a breathtaking dance of greens and purples, was a sickly, pulsing ochre, like a bruise blooming across the vast, indifferent canvas of the night sky. I pressed my forehead against the cold glass, my breath misting the pain. My fingers, numb despite the worn gloves I still wore, traced the outline of the distorted light show. It was wrong. All of it was wrong. The signal, the one that had dragged me to this desolate outpost at the edge of nowhere, had stopped hours ago. The silence it left behind was worse than the constant, maddening hum. It was a vacuum, a void that felt deliberate, as if whatever had been broadcasting its impossible, maddening message had finally achieved its purpose and then simply ceased to be, or more terrifyingly, had moved on. My breath hitched. The thrumming intensified, a low frequency that resonated in my teeth. In my bones, the very air felt heavy, charged with an unseen energy. It looked less like light and more like a vast, inflamed wound. I remembered the initial data, the impossible coherence of the signal, not random static, not a pulsar, not any natural phenomenon known to man. It was structured, intricate, like a language I could almost grasp. And the source, my colleagues had called me mad. Dean, they'd said. I read chasing ghosts in the static, but I knew there was something out there. And then the signal had changed. It had shifted from a plea, a desperate broadcast, to something else, something that felt like awareness. It was as if the entity, whatever it was, had finally noticed me, not just noticed, but understood. It had tailored its message not to humanity, but to me, to my specific wavelengths of fear, my deepest anxieties. I backed away from the window, boots crunching on the frozen floor. The metal of the station groaned around me, a symphony of stressed metal and groaning ice. I could feel it now, a presence. Not a physical one, not something I could see or touch, but a pressure against my mind, a vast alien consciousness that brushed against my own like the wing of some colossal, unseen moth. I stumbled towards the console, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the controls. I needed to document this. I needed to. What sent a warning? To whom? The world had dismissed my findings. They wouldn't listen now, not until it was too late. The thrumming grew louder, the metallic shriek of the station rising in pitch. The ochre aurora outside was no longer pulsing. It was writhing. Tendrils of sickly light snaked across the sky, twisting and contorting in impossible geometries. It was like watching a tumor grow, a disease spreading across the skin of the cosmos. My internal chronometer showed it was nearing the predicted peak of the aurora's activity, but this was no storm I had ever witnessed, no geomagnetic anomaly that could explain this grotesque display. This was alive. The signal had been a lure, a beacon, and I, in my arrogance, had sailed right into its trap. I remembered the fragments of the signal that had finally broken through my scientific detachment, the fleeting glimpses of what lay beyond. Not stars, not nebulae, but an architecture of impossible angles, a geometry that defied Euclidean space. It was a place where the rules I understood ceased to apply, a place where it resided. The pressure in my head intensified, a dull ache blooming behind my eyes. It felt like my thoughts were being pulled, stretched, distorted. I fought against it, clinging to the familiar logic of my training, the comforting solidity of scientific fact. But fact was a fragile thing in the face of this otherness. I looked at the readings on the console, energy signatures I couldn't categorize, gravimetric fluctuations that shouldn't exist. The air temperature was plummeting, the frost creeping in from the edges of the room, coating the equipment in a fine, glittering dust. Then a new sound, a scraping, faint at first, then louder. It was coming from outside, from the very structure of the station itself. Not the wind, not the ice. It was a slow, deliberate drag, like something immense and heavy being pulled across the metal hull. My skin prickled. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but where? There was nowhere to go. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the room. The thrumming was a physical force pushing against my chest, making it hard to breathe. The scraping stopped. Then a single sharp rap on the metal door. My blood, which had been racing, seemed to freeze. It wasn't a knock of flesh and bone. It was the dull, resonant thud of something hard. Something not of this world. I stood frozen, my gaze locked on the reinforced steel door. The ochre aurora outside pulsed one last time, a dying gasp of light, and then the sky went black. Utterly, impossibly black. The scraping was gone. The rap did not come again. I was still alive in the weather station under a sky that was no longer wrong but simply absent. The entity had seen me, had reached out, and then, for reasons I could never fathom, had withdrawn. It had left me with the knowledge, the terrible, crushing certainty that we are not alone, and that what shares this universe with us is ancient, incomprehensible, and utterly indifferent to our existence. What had it wanted, and would it ever return?